a green light, a screaming woman, and a baby who, in the story we all know, gets left on a doorstep in the cold. But what if that doorstep never happened? What if the Dursleys never opened that door and instead Harry Potter grew up loved? Because everything you think you know about the boy who lived was built on 11 years of a cupboard under the stairs. Take that away, and you don't just get a happier kid. You get a completely different war. Let's set the scene. In the real timeline, Dumbledore leaves baby Harry on the Dursleys' porch with nothing but a letter, betting the whole future of the wizarding world on blood wards, and a hope that Petunia would show him kindness. She didn't. Harry grew up starved of affection, starved of food some nights, treated like a stain on the family name, and that mattered more than anyone in the books ever admits out loud. But imagine Dumbledore chooses differently. Therefore, this time, he leaves Harry with someone who actually wants him. Maybe it's a squib cousin of the Potters. Maybe it's an old friend of Lily's who never went into hiding. The magic of the story doesn't change. The wards can still work. What changes is the boy behind them. Because here's the thing people miss. Voldemort didn't just try to kill a baby that night in Godric's Hollow. He accidentally built his own worst enemy out of the pieces he left behind. A piece of his soul latched onto Harry, and it carried more than magic. It carried Voldemort's own experiences, his fear, his fury, his total conviction that love is a weakness for lesser people. And Harry, unloved and alone, was the perfect vessel for those feelings to feel true. He understood loneliness because he lived it. He understood being underestimated because the Dursleys did it to him every single day. So when the connection to Voldemort opened up in his dreams, in his scar, in his nightmares, Harry had first-hand material to draw from. Therefore, the real Harry Potter isn't just fighting Voldemort. Some nights he's fighting a distorted mirror of himself. But take away the abuse and that mirror cracks. A Harry who grew up loved doesn't carry the same raw material. He doesn't flinch at anger the way abused kids flinch, because he's never had to survive someone else's rage in a small house on Privet Drive. He doesn't quietly assume he deserves less because nobody ever told him he did. And that changes the entire emotional wiring of his connection to the Dark Lord. So let's talk about who this Harry actually is, because he's a very different kid walking through platform 9 3/4. This Harry isn't shy about asking for things. He isn't stunned every time someone is nice to him, the way book canon Harry practically short-circuits the first time Mrs. Weasley hugs him. He expects kindness, because kindness has been the baseline of his whole life. Therefore, he walks into Hogwarts less like a starving stray, and more like a kid who already knows his own worth. And that one shift ripples through everything. Take the mirror of Erised. In the books, 11-year-old Harry sits in front of that mirror for hours, hypnotized, staring at a vision of his dead parents standing beside him, because it's the one thing he's never had. It nearly destroys him emotionally. Dumbledore has to gently pull him away before the mirror consumes him completely. But a loved Harry sits in front of that same mirror and sees something else. Maybe he still sees his parents, because grief for people you never got to meet doesn't disappear just because you had a good childhood. Therefore, the loss is still real, but it doesn't have the same starving quality to it. He's not empty going in. He's not trying to fill a hole that's been there his whole life. That's the difference between wanting and needing, and it's the difference that keeps him from being as easy a target for manipulation later on. And manipulation is exactly the word, because let's be honest about Dumbledore for a second. In the actual books, Dumbledore's entire strategy depends on Harry being isolated enough, humble enough, and grateful enough to accept an enormous amount of risk without asking too many hard questions. A confident, secure Harry doesn't play that role as easily. He asks harder questions earlier. He pushes back on Dumbledore's secrecy instead of quietly accepting it the way Canon Harry does for years. Therefore, Order of the Phoenix might not take 5 books to boil over. It might boil over in year 2. Now let's get into the real heart of this, the actual relationship between Harry and Voldemort, because loved Harry doesn't experience that bond the same way at all. In the books, one of the most disturbing truths about Harry and Voldemort is how much darkness genuinely lives inside Harry, and how much he has to consciously choose not to become what he could become. Parseltongue isn't just a cool party trick, it's a symptom. The visions aren't just plot convenience. They're proof that a piece of Voldemort is wired directly into Harry's head, and it terrifies him, because on some level he recognizes the temptation. In Chamber of Secrets, the Sorting Hat nearly puts him in Slytherin. Harry begs it not to, and it listens. But that scene only works because 11-year-old Harry is scared of what he might become if given power and permission to use it. An abused kid who has spent his life being told he's worthless is exactly the kind of kid who fears his own capacity for darkness, because he's had to bottle up so much anger just to survive the Dursleys. Therefore, a loved Harry approaches that same choice from a completely different angle. He's not terrified of the darkness inside him because he hasn't spent a decade suppressing rage at people who mistreated him. He's more curious than afraid. He might actually consider Slytherin longer, not because he's evil, but because ambition doesn't scare a kid who's never had to hide who he is. And that single difference reshapes his whole relationship to power for the rest of the story. Here's where it gets genuinely dark, in a good way for storytelling. Voldemort's entire identity is built on the belief that love makes people weak, and that the strong take what they want without apology. He was an orphan too, remember? He grew up unloved in a Muggle orphanage, and he turned that pain into a philosophy. Connection is a liability, and only power is real. Canon Harry is Voldemort's proof that the theory is wrong, because Harry survives again and again, specifically because people love him. Lily's love saves him as a baby. Sirius, Lupin, the Weasleys, Dumbledore's own strange guilt-driven affection, all of it becomes armor. But that argument only lands if Harry starts from nothing and builds love the hard way. Therefore, a Harry who was loved from day one doesn't prove Voldemort wrong through some slow, hard-won journey. He simply is the counter-argument, standing there from the very beginning, and Voldemort has to reckon with that immediately instead of over 7 books. Picture their first real encounter in this version. Quirrell's turban comes off in the 3rd floor corridor, and instead of a broken, malnourished 11-year-old barely standing on his own 2 feet, Voldemort is looking at a kid who is scared. Sure, but not desperate. Not starving for validation the way Canon Harry is starving for it in that scene. Therefore, the psychological chess match changes completely. Voldemort's usual move is to find the crack in someone. The unloved child, the resentful sibling, the person nobody ever chose. And here's the problem for him. Loved Harry doesn't have that crack. So Voldemort has to work so much harder to find a way in. And that's genuinely terrifying for him, because Voldemort's whole power over people is built on exploiting exactly that kind of wound. Look at how he recruits later in the books. He doesn't build an army out of confident, secure people. He builds it out of people like Peter Pettigrew, desperate for approval his whole life. People like Draco Malfoy, terrified of disappointing his father. People like the Death Eaters who need Voldemort to make them feel like they matter. Therefore, Voldemort is, in a strange way, a predator who specializes in unloved people, and loved Harry simply isn't on the menu. But don't mistake that for Harry being untouchable. But loved doesn't mean invincible, and that's important. This Harry can still be baited by anger, because anger isn't the same thing as insecurity. In canon, Harry's rage at Sirius's death gets used against him directly. Voldemort plants a false vision. Harry rushes to the Ministry, and it costs him everything. Therefore, the emotional lever Voldemort pulls isn't "you're worthless," because that lever doesn't exist anymore. It's "you can't protect the people you love," which hits even harder on a kid who has actually experienced being protected and doesn't want to lose that feeling. It's a different kind of vulnerability, not a hollow one. A full one, which in some ways hurts more because there's more to lose. Let's talk about occlumency, because this is where Canon Harry's trauma becomes a literal security vulnerability. In Order of the Phoenix, Snape tries to teach Harry to shut Voldemort out of his mind, and Harry fails spectacularly, over and over. Part of that failure is teenage stubbornness, but part of it is something deeper. Harry's mind is so full of pain, so full of unprocessed anger at the Dursleys, at Umbridge, at a world that's never given him a fair shot, that Voldemort's presence has plenty of dark, messy emotion to hook into. His mental defenses are basically built on cracked foundation, because the foundation itself was never solid to begin with. Therefore, Voldemort successfully plants the false vision of Sirius being tortured. Harry can't tell real from fake, and it leads directly to Sirius's death at the Ministry of Magic. Now imagine loved Harry sitting in that same dungeon with Snape. He's still an emotional teenager. He still struggles. But his baseline mental state isn't built on years of suppressed rage and quiet self-loathing. Therefore, the false vision doesn't land as easily because there's less raw, festering pain for Voldemort's intrusion to disguise itself inside of. It doesn't mean occlumency becomes effortless. It means the whole mind invasion strategy Voldemort relies on becomes a much harder puzzle for him to solve, because he's used to breaking into houses with the door already half open, and this time the door is shut. That single change might mean Sirius lives. And if Sirius lives, the entire back half of the series shifts, because so much of Harry's grief-fueled recklessness in the final 2 books comes directly from that loss. Canon Harry chases Voldemort into the Department of Mysteries, partly out of duty, but mostly out of a desperate, lonely need to save the one person who ever felt like family. Take away that specific wound, and Harry's motivations in Half-Blood Prince and Deathly Hallows become less about grief and more about principle. He's not fighting to avenge Sirius. He's fighting because it's right. That's a colder kind of hero, but arguably a more dangerous one for Voldemort to face because grief can be manipulated. Principle is much harder to bend. There's also the diary. Think about Chamber of Secrets for a second, because 16-year-old memory Voldemort, trapped inside Tom Riddle's diary, is basically running a grooming operation on 11-year-old Ginny Weasley. He finds a lonely, insecure kid desperate to prove herself in a big, loud family, and he slowly convinces her to trust him with her secrets. It works because Ginny feels unseen. But here's the interesting hypothetical. What if that diary had ended up in loved Harry's hands instead, the way it almost does when Lucius Malfoy slips it into his school things at Flourish and Blots? Canon Harry actually does interact with the diary a little, and it doesn't fully hook him, because even broken as he is, some part of him is wary of things that write back. Therefore, a securely loved Harry would be even harder for that diary to work on. Riddle's whole method depends on finding a wound and pressing on it gently until it opens. A kid with no open wound just closes the book and goes to bed. Now, here's the twist that really reshapes the Horcrux plotline. Canon Harry's willingness to walk into the Forbidden Forest and die in Deathly Hallows only makes sense because of who he's become. A kid so used to sacrificing himself, so used to believing his life is worth less than everyone else's, that walking toward Voldemort feels almost natural to him. It's the tragic logic of an abused childhood dressed up as heroism. But loved Harry doesn't have that same instinct baked in. Therefore, the writers in this version have to work so much harder to get him to that clearing because he actually believes his life has value. He'll still do it because he's still fundamentally good and the people he loves are on the line. But it costs him more internally, and he fights that decision the entire way there, instead of walking toward it with the quiet resignation Canon Harry carries. And that changes the ending in a way most fans never think about. When Harry does die and come back, the conversation with Dumbledore in that white, foggy King's Cross station between life and death hits completely differently. Canon Harry has spent his whole life believing he doesn't matter, so choosing to come back and keep fighting is almost a rebellion against everything the Dursleys taught him. Loved Harry already believes he matters. Therefore, his choice to return isn't about proving his own worth. It's simply about finishing the job, and that's a colder, more determined kind of decision. Less about identity, more about principle. Let's jump to the graveyard in Goblet of Fire, because this is arguably the first time Canon Harry and Voldemort actually talk to each other as something close to equals, and it's worth asking how differently that scene plays out. Voldemort is freshly reborn, weak, testing his own new body, and he wants an audience for his triumph. He wants Harry terrified. He wants Harry begging. And Canon Harry, exhausted, orphaned, and used to feeling powerless around authority figures, mostly obliges because his instinct after 14 years with the Dursleys is to survive the moment rather than to challenge it. But loved Harry walks into that graveyard with a different instinct entirely. He's still terrified because it's Voldemort, and only a fool wouldn't be. Therefore, the fear is real, but it isn't laced with the same old, practiced compliance canon Harry has spent years perfecting under Vernon Dursley's roof. He might talk back sooner. He might refuse to grovel in a way that actually unsettles Voldemort, because Voldemort has built his entire self-image around being the one who makes people afraid. And a scared kid who still won't fully bow is a much harder performance to control. And that detail matters more than it seems, because Voldemort's cruelty has always fed on submission. He wants Cedric Diggory's death to feel meaningless, because meaninglessness is power to him. He wants Harry to feel small in that graveyard the same way small feels familiar to Harry. Therefore, take away the familiarity with smallness, and Voldemort loses one of his sharpest psychological weapons before the duel even starts. Think about what that means for the wand connection later in that same scene too. When their wands lock together in Prior Incantatem and the echoes of Voldemort's victims start to appear, Canon Harry holds on mostly through desperation and instinct. He's fighting because stopping means dying, and dying has always felt like the more familiar option to a kid who's never been taught his life has value beyond his usefulness. But loved Harry holds on because he has actual reasons to get home. People are waiting for him. Therefore, the same physical moment carries a completely different emotional engine underneath it. And Voldemort, who reads intent and weakness the way other people read facial expressions, would feel that difference immediately, even if he couldn't fully explain it. Let's zoom out and land the real point of all this. Voldemort spent his entire life building a philosophy on the idea that love is weakness and only power is real. And the tragic irony the books never fully explore is that Voldemort's proof against himself was always sitting right there. A boy who survived because people loved him, who grew up broken because nobody did, and who still chose to fight for love anyway. Therefore, change Harry's childhood, and you don't just remove his trauma. You remove Voldemort's greatest fear before it even fully forms, because now he's not facing a wounded orphan clawing his way towards self-worth. He's facing someone who was never wounded that way in the first place. Someone who represents the exact thing Voldemort has spent his whole life running from. Proof that connection isn't a weakness at all. It's the only kind of power he never figured out how to have. And maybe that's the darkest twist of all. A broken Harry Potter was always dangerous to Voldemort. But a whole one? A Harry who was loved from the very beginning? He might just be the one thing Voldemort was never built to survive. If you want to keep digging into stories like this, breaking down the psychology behind the characters we think we already know, subscribe, Avenzo, hit a like, and press the bell icon to get updated.